Card design is a non-linear process. I often start with the bare bones idea. What if I designed a Coven card that made you break Coven? After plenty of iterations, designs, and even a complete thematic overhaul, I landed here, Sun Gold Heretic. And since I'm the Polarization guy, in no small part due to my last video blowing up, I was wondering how this would affect the play patterns and gameplay. After a bit of thinking, my conclusion was simple. Sun Gold Heretic is just a great card. It's great on curve and off curve because of its shade ability. Its second ability requires some effort to trigger, but is worth it. It disables itself due to the nature of Coven, but it's all alleviated by the shade ability making Coven much easier to put together. It's just good. Everywhere. It doesn't really have a downside, aside from the mandatory trigger, but I kind of put that in as a special little flavor. You can easily make that a May. In my last video, I talked a lot about what makes a card polarizing versus what makes a card strong, but I never really gave a solution. It was mostly all just theoretical. It's because there isn't really a solution at all. It's a balance between polarizing and non-polarizing. However, designing cards intentionally to cover multiple use cases is itself a problem. This leads to power creep. Magic players don't really know what they want. Well, this is applicable to people in general, but in the context of Magic, the cards that consistently get people the most excited are cards like Corey Steelcutter and Chivalric Alliance. Both of these cards have a key feature in common. They are self-synergizing. These cards tend to require very little to no enabling. Corey Steelcutter is an equipment that already makes creatures to equip to, even making more when you cast more spells, and Chivalric Alliance triggers on attacks and has a mode to create tokens to attack with. Magic players love these kinds of cards, but I believe that in aggregate, they damage the game by restricting play patterns, decreasing player agency of both the user and their opponent, and further polarizing the game in an unenjoyable way. This subject is a little bit more difficult to approach than the last one because it is more nuanced. There is more to the subject than just polarization, and I love these kinds of cards too. The new Evendo Brush Razor is one of my favorite cards revealed in recent years, and it might finally inspire me to make that artifact land scraps deck I've been thinking about. The card that I mentioned in the intro, Sun Gold Heretic, is a self-synergizing card, and I think it's extremely cool. The mechanics all work together so beautifully and give opportunities for very interesting gameplay patterns, and together, they all make so much sense. But that's the problem. Similar designs have been cropping up more and more over the years. The example I often bring up is Vein Ripper, a creature that triggers when a creature dies and requires you to sacrifice a creature when you cast a spell. These two abilities work together very well, and it just makes sense. He should make you sacrifice a creature, because he triggers off of creatures dying. This entire phenomenon is magnified when you look at commanders. When the most popular type of commander is one that is a payoff and an enabler, you stop printing cards like Vorel of the Hulkblade and start printing cards like Zimone, Paradox Sculptor. Due to Commander's status as the most popular, and for better or for worse, the most important format for card design, this sort of self-synergy is perceived as the default, especially by players that didn't play the game before it was a default. The purveyor of r/Custom Magic's Find the Mistakes post commented that this is something that people even tend to point out in his posts as a mistake, that the cards don't enable themselves. In Commander specifically, cards have to be able to hold their own much more than in 1v1 formats, as they're competing with much more splashy cards from 3 times the number of opponents. But self-synergy is still synergy, and cards still become more powerful through this. As Magic has aged, cards have required less and less enabling and have leaned more and more on their generic strength. Older extended formats often won games based on powerful synergies such as Fires of Yavimaya and Sapperling Burst, or density-based dredge decks that needed pieces from 4 or 5 different sets. There are still synergies and synergy-based decks in the modern MTG landscape, but each card is much more powerful on its own. Psychic Frog, Murktide Regent, Pyrogoyf, even cards that aren't competitive format staples like Conclave Sledge Captain and Ursine Monstrosity. These sort of threats have always been around, as meshing mechanics feels great, but their nature has changed over the years. Let's start. Sengir Vampire is a great example of a self-synergizing threat. When it kills a creature in combat, it gets larger. This makes it easier to kill creatures in combat and harder to kill itself, making it larger again. This card is quite famous, and one of the more treasured creatures in early Magic, only slightly supplanted by the raw power of Juzumjin. However, that's all it really does. It has no way to force you to block it. If you can't kill it in combat, generally the correct play is to let it hit you until you can either kill it, your opponent, or you have to start chump blocking to stay alive. Obviously, that's a powerful effect, but it still does take 5 turns on its own, and it's a 5-drop. Sengir Vampire is most powerful when your opponent misplays and does not play around it properly, which means that in most cases there's ample counterplay and space to improve as a player. Moving forward a decade or so, we have a new beatstick in black, Korlash, Heir to Blackblade. Korlash was the top end of most mono-black aggro and tempo decks in its era, and to some extent, is the most obviously self-synergizing card in this video. It literally has an effect naming itself. Kordlash was very strong top end because he scaled with the game and turned cards that were traditionally dead draws, lands, and redundant legendary creatures into more power. Kordlash doesn't ask for your opponent to do anything wrong to win, he just naturally scales and kills your opponent while getting value and being very hard to kill. He does have his downsides, however, as each Kordlash discarded is one more that you can no longer cast. Additionally, he has no evasion whatsoever. He just beats you until you stop moving. As a side note, I love Kordlash and could never hurt him. Keep going strong, Bear of the Black Blade. Now, in the present day, we have Baragoyf, a 3-drop with a symphony of ridiculous abilities that work extremely well when combined, Baragoyf to 1. The base premise of Baragoyf is that he is a Goyf, so giving him a way to mill cards makes sense, as what dies feeds the Baragoyf. Since the Goyf's whole gimmick is high stats, we can make this mill effect based off of his stats. That makes sense. This would require some sort of trigger based off of stats, and combat damage is a clean way to measure power. Sure, okay, makes sense. So how do we make it possible for players to connect with their Baragoyf? While not strictly evasion, Death Touch makes the thing an absolute nightmare to block, which makes it easier to trigger. Lastly, often big Chunga stat sticks like Tarmogoyf are best dealt by bypassing them entirely. You might be hitting me with your 4-5 Tarmogoyf, but my army of tiny goons can race it, especially if they have flying. But Baragoyf has a way around that. Just give it lifelink, and you can't race it. It makes sense. This is just a simple, logical progression. Each step justified by the last, and it all just makes sense. The other thing that I would like you to notice is that each card has been cheaper than the last, in mana, and in the case of Baragoyf, in pips. Having a stupid snowballing 7-drop is fine, because it's a 7-drop. Immediately dying to Doomblade will make any 7-drop useless. It should be good, but as self-synergizing threats come down earlier, it makes them harder to stop. I joked recently about amazing mold to 4s in Canlander, one of them being double land Mox Diamond Balance, but I legitimately think that land Lotus Thoughtseize Baragoyf might be a better mold to 4. This sort of card design also leads to more polarizing games. I recently spoke to a good friend of mine over a pleasant match of Canadian Highlander, the classic white-black taxes, feat Necropotence, and Teferi's Protection, versus 5-color Planeswalker Omnitel. And when brought up, he immediately agreed that play draw feels a lot more relevant these days. No one dies to their crypt flips anymore, and the only thing that really matters is how fast your start is. These self-synergizing cards do so much on their own that any one runs away with the game by themselves. So sticking one becomes the only priority that either player has. Just in the last few years, they have printed a bunch that I can think of off the top of my head. I've already mentioned Psychofrog, Delve Dragon, and Terrorism Bear, but Inti, Evora, Ayara's Oathsworn, Gao, Detective's Phoenix, Ocelot Pride, Guide of Souls, Seasoned Dungeoneer, these cards all get enabled simply by existing as themselves, and not a single one of these costs more than 4 mana, with Dungeoneer as the only 4-drop, and Dungeoneer is a stupid card. This has also established itself in the actual mechanics in modern gameplay. We can see the same sort of Sengir Kordlash Baragoyf progression in the unstoppable mechanics in Magic. First we had emblems, which required you to protect a planeswalker for several turns and likely kill them to get. Once you had it, it couldn't be interacted with, sure, but the amount of effort required to get there was generally extremely high, and decks could not be built with planeswalker emblems in mind. In 2016, we were introduced to the Monarchy. Monarch was generally a fine mechanic in most formats, except for lower power limited sets. I'm sorry for your trauma, Colin. And it didn't see much play. It gave you a card advantage engine that could not be Swordsed or Krosan Gripped or even Chaos Warped. It was in the command zone, and you had to interact with it on its own terms, deal commander damage to the Monarch. However, the only Monarch cards that saw any consistent play were Palace Jailer and Custody Lich, 2 Monarch creatures which immediately removed an opponent's creature. These cards were much more powerful than the rest because they self-synergized. Eating an opponent's creature made it harder to take back the Monarchy, so the effects work together. It makes sense. These days, we have the Initiative, which has been by far the worst offender. Not only does it do more than Monarchy, a lot more, with flexible options that allow you to adapt to the game state, but multiple instances of Initiative are not redundant, unlike Monarch, and most Initiative cards seem hell-bent on letting you keep it. Seasoned Dungeoneer has Unblockable, and White Plume Adventure is a 3-drop that can easily be stuck on turn 1 if your deck is built around it, plus it basically has Vigilance. Even the smaller threats at lower rarity have ways to fight for the initiative. Goliath Paladin has Vigilance and Avenging Hunter has Trample. These cards effectively remove a large portion of the already little counterplay and emblem effects on their own, with no other support. This ties into a greater point of cards often not having downsides anymore, even when removed. When there were fewer self-sustaining value engines, there was a real chance that you could run out of cards, or have too little late game power if you ran small creatures. For Commander specifically, these days every individual card played in Commander deck tends to replace itself or get some value, even without untapping. There's obviously some selection bias, as people won't play or notice the bad cards, but commanders like Henzi and Arcades the Strategy really make me wonder what we're supposed to do. In my experience, Henzi is particularly egregious, because he's everything you'd ever want. A mana dork, a sack outlet, and a card draw engine, all stapled to a cheap body that can effectively not be removed without ability loss removal, such as Darksteel Mutation or Song of the Dryads. This leads to a lot more two ships in the night gameplay. Everyone just kind of plays their own game and hopes that it's enough to beat all the players, except the one with the most engines wins. This sort of gameplay is so prevalent that it's even taken over CDH. Stick your value engines such as Rhystic Study or Esper Sentinel and draw cards off of it until you're ready to combo. Look at one of the most recent sets, the Diamond Mine card. Of the 5 mechanics, Endure, Flurry, Renew, Mobilize, and Harmonize, only Flurry is not inherently a 2-for-1. People love getting value off effects, so Wizards will print more cards that allow for more value, even if it degrades gameplay quality. This also happened to Hearthstone, where an express design goal was to remove attrition decks from the game. You will never be able to run your opponent out of cards like you used to be able to. It feels really odd building decks with a lot of these self-synergizing threats, because I often feel like I don't even need to think about much. It really feels odd building decks with a lot of these self-synergizing threats, because I often feel like I don't even need to think much about interactions. My mono-white $30 vintage deck built itself because I just slapped in the best snowballing threats I had in descending order of power, assuming they were budget, together with all the best hate bears, and the deck was finished. When building decks like Canlander Paradox Academy, a density-based artifact combo deck that is a little too complicated to explain right now, I always think about the right ratios of enabler to payoff, and even the ratios in those categories. How many mana rocks am I playing? Which combos can I afford to play? Is having a graveyard theme, sub-theme, or package worth it? No. But when I build a lot of creature decks these days, self-synergizing threats do not fill a niche within deck building. They are the enabler and the payoff, the A and the B. I just play them because they play themselves and are too good not to play, squared away in their own corner. That's boring. Humans always want things easy, but we work best when we are actually challenged and something is demanded of us. A pile full of cards that all work with themselves isn't interesting to play. The best threats will be solved almost instantly, and people will simply play them in descending order of power. Gameplay decisions make things interesting, and self-synergizing threats make both deck building and the gameplay more boring. Deck building because they're too strong not to play, and gameplay because they're too self-sufficient not to address. Downsides are fun to build around and play against, so making more cards that perfectly work themselves make games feel very one-dimensional. This is, of course, a nuanced topic. When Wizards wants to design cards that are stronger than last year's cards, they shouldn't just take Shadows of the Past and make it Surveil 2 instead, or On-Crop Crasher and make him a 4-3. In some ways, this essay goes directly against my previous video's ideas, because there's no real way to increase power without either making more self-synergizing cards or making more polarized cards. They are, to some extent, mutually exclusive. I am not Amnio 2. I do not believe the dream is dead. But I do think that Wizards is headed in the wrong direction with these sorts of effects. Cards like Barrowgoyf and Seasoned Engineer should never have been printed, and are generally detrimental to the formats they touch. The players, including me, may dislike this, but it will ensure the long-term health of the game. Cards need to generate less value.